Joshua 7 this morning. We are into our second lesson now with the children of Israel's new leader, Joshua. And we've spent so much time in these last weeks with Moses. I just kind of need to remind us, we're with Joshua now. He's the new leader, not Moses. And you'll recall that he was one of the 12 spies that went into the land originally 40 years earlier when they were getting ready to supposedly possess the promised land. And it didn't work out that way. Only 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, thought they could take it. And then, as a result, God punishes the people and says, well, everyone except for Joshua and Caleb that's 20 years or older will die here in this wilderness. And we talked about that. And then God chooses a new leader. And that's important that we notice this. The people didn't choose Joshua to be the leader. God chose Joshua to be the leader. And we see that in Joshua 1. God comes to him and tells him, you are going to be the leader of the children of Israel. And in Joshua 1, which we never really studied, but in Joshua 1 we see where God promises he will be with him, tells him twice to be of good courage, and tells him twice that he will be prosperous. So Joshua is the new leader, and in some ways you could say Joshua has a little bit of an advantage on Moses. First, he got to witness the mistakes of Moses. And Moses didn't make a lot of mistakes, but there were some mistakes that Moses made. And Joshua had the benefit of seeing how leadership works and what works and what doesn't. He also, I think, got to experience the wisdom of Moses. And then, unlike Moses, he was able to garner from this experience before he took leadership. Because Moses didn't. Moses was kind of thrown into this. Yes, he had been a leader. We mentioned this a few weeks back, that Moses had probably led an army of some type when he was in Pharaoh's court. So he had some leadership skills. But he had never led 2 million people. And not to mention, he's leading them on a major trip with all that's involved in that. So Joshua had the benefit of being able to garner experience before he was asked by God to lead. And now we're seeing Joshua, last week we saw part of it, that he's doing what Moses never did, and that's actually going to the promised land. A great deal happens in between chapter 2 and chapter 6 is where we're actually at today. I said 7, we're in chapter 6. I'm sorry. We're in chapter 6. Chapter 7 is next week. And I was working on that yesterday, and so I'm in chapter 7. But we're in chapter 6. So a lot happens between chapter 2 and chapter 6. We didn't get to study chapter 4, which I'd loved, or chapter 2. I think it's chapter 2. Now my mind's erratic here of where we are. I think it's chapter 2 let me look here. Rahab. Yeah, Rahab. And we didn't get to study that lesson. I was really wanting to go into that, but our material that didn't allow us to study chapter 2. So a lot happens between there and chapter 6, and we did talk about chapter 3 last week, but we didn't get to study this or talk about the two spies that went in. Recall I mentioned last week the 2 spies swam across the Jordan, and they actually went to Rahab's house, who was a harlot or a prostitute. I'd love to get into that as to why they chose that house. Maybe one day we'll get to teach that lesson. And you'll recall that the military or the Secret Service or whatever there was of Jericho had found out that there was 2 spies that had come in from the children of Israel in the land, and they knew it. And they told the king, and the king said, find them. And so the word got out that they went to Rahab's house. So they go to Rahab's house. And Rahab lies, tells these military people, they're not here. If you go real quick, you'll find them this way. And, of course, she had hid them on her roof under some flax. And so a covenant is made between Rahab and the spies that if she hangs a scarlet cord or rope from her house, that when they come in to take Jericho, anybody that's in her house will be spared. And so that's a story we didn't get to study, but that happened in between where we are. So that kind of brings us to chapter 6 and verse 1. And the children of Israel are getting ready now to possess the Jericho, the very, very fortified city of Jericho. And you notice in verse 1 it says, now Jericho was straitly shut up. How does yours say that? Tightly shut up. Because of the children of Israel. And what does yours say after that? None went in? And none went out. So let me back up here a bit before we get into that verse. So these people in Jericho are keenly aware that they have 2 million people outside their walls. How would you not know that 2 million people are out there? Now, they were also aware that before they had crossed the Jordan, that they were on the other side of the Jordan. But they knew that they were the first city after they crossed the Jordan. So in their minds, they see the children of Israel and their army as a threat. Who wouldn't? And by the way, the city of Jericho is a very small city. We'll get into that in a minute, but it only had probably 1,200 people. So if you're 1,200 people and you're knowing that 2 million people are not far from you, that's a threat. But in their mind, while they were a threat and they knew eventually they were going to have to deal with this threat, in their mind they knew that the Jordan River was separating them from these people. And they also knew that at this time of year, as we talked about last week, the Jordan River was swollen. It was springtime. It was much, much bigger than it was normally, and the river was moving with great force. So in their minds, there's no way the children of Israel are going to be a threat immediately. It wasn't an imminent threat. They had some amount of time to prepare for this. So imagine what happens when all of a sudden they see what the children of Israel saw, and that is that the Jordan River is stopped 20 miles upstream. And you remember what the Bible says, that there was a great wall or a great heap of water? Do you think that Jericho may have saw that too? Because you're talking about a lot of water moving. If I remember right, it's like 3 billion cubic feet of water annually. So you're talking about a lot of water that's stopping at one time and all it's doing is going up. I would imagine even people in Jericho saw that. So we already know that in chapter 2, Rahab had told the 2 spies that we're in terror of you already. All of us are fearful because of you. So if they were scared already, imagine what they must have felt like when they see the Jordan River stopped and all of a sudden these people are crossing over. The feeling inside of these walls, I don't know that I could describe it. I don't think we in America have ever felt anything like that before. We have experienced 9/11, no doubt, was a scary time in our country. But we've never had a foreign army on the shores that was getting ready to attack us, and we felt boxed in like these people did. So the response that they have here is the Bible says in verse 1 that they just, what does yours say? Mine says straightly shut. Yours says what? Tightly shut the gates. So these walls are shut and there's no one coming in, no one going out. Now, these walls, if you look it up online, you'll see that there is some pretty interesting pictures of the walls. It's a doubled wall system. There's a retaining wall, and there's 2 different. And actually, when I looked this up, I've studied this before, and some years back I also taught this lesson, and it's not consistent with what you're finding on the measurements of walls. But the thought is that the first one is like between 20 and 26 foot tall. That's a pretty tall wall. And I don't know how you penetrate that. And then the second was separated by an embankment. And in between those walls, in between this embankment was 6 acres. Now, the city of Jericho itself was very small. Do any of you know how big it was? You might be surprised if you hear this. The city itself was no bigger than 7 acres. Now, I live on 7 acres. It's hard to imagine 1,200 people living in my 7 acres. But you have these walls, and in between, there's 6 acres in between the walls of the embankment and the walls. So we know that Rahab lived on the wall. So these walls are thick, so people were living on the wall. So that kind of explains some of it. And matter of fact, in 1907, there was an excavation team in 1868, one in 1907, and one in 1952 that were done of the city of Jericho. And what's interesting about it is that the city of Jericho is not mentioned anywhere in secular history. The only place it was ever mentioned is in the Bible. So when they found it, it was really, really cool. And much of what they found, which I'll get into later, validates what the Bible says. Some really incredible detailed things that only the Bible talks about, and yet what they found backed up the Bible. Really cool. So in verse 2 it says that the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given into your hand Jericho and the king thereof, the mighty men of valor." Now, since there's not a lot, there's really nothing except for Joshua 6 that tells us about Jericho. We don't know anything about Jericho. In secular history, there's not much the mighty men of valor, don't know much about those men. Don't know how awesome they were, but it does appear they were a well-trained force. And we do know this, that when the 40 spies went in, the 12 spies went in 40 years earlier, they were impressed with them. They were very impressed. So, and God himself here refers to them. In verse 2, if yours says it the same way as mine, God says they were mighty men of valor. God refers to them this way. So apparently they were very experienced military force and imposing. Now, I would imagine that the regions and the cities around Jericho are also impacted by this force of the children of Israel outside of them. And they're watching very closely to see what's going to happen with Jericho. And as best I know from my studies, Jericho was the most fortified of all the cities. Not all the cities had walls like this. And it does... I kind of tried to research why would Jericho be so fortified. And I really couldn't come up with a lot, except that they were protecting themselves from a lot of people that would come through that area. I guess they had a really good source of water. They were very wary of losing the valuable resources they had. So it just seems like kind of overkill for a 7-acre area to build a wall that big. But apparently, whatever they had, they really wanted to protect. And they had a pretty good military as well. Then verses 3 through 5, God told Joshua, "You will compass the city." Does somebody else say different than compass?
"And you shall march around the city."
March around the city. Mm-hmm. "All you men of war, and go around the city once. This you shall do 6 days. The 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of ram's horns, and the 7th day you shall compass the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow with the trumpets. And it shall come to pass, when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city shall fall down flat, and the people shall ascend, every man straight before him." So while I would imagine the Defense Department within Jericho is strategizing about what they're going to do, God is laying out a very different plan for the Israeli army, if you want to call it that. And it is a strange plan, isn't it? If you were to hear this, like that's the plan? It's a really fortified city. You know what's in it, and you're just supposed to march around it. And then on the 7th day, after you march around it 7 times, it's just the walls are going to fall flat. And, that's the message that God is telling Joshua to give to his people. But you don't sense anything here from Joshua that there's any doubt or that he questioned God. Nothing. He seems perfectly fine with what God told him. In verses 6 through 9, says that Joshua, the son of Nun, called the priests and said, "Take up the ark of the covenant. Let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord." And he said to the people, "Pass on and compass the city. Let him that is armed pass on beyond the ark of the Lord." And it came to pass, when Joshua had spoken unto the people, that the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram horn passed on before the Lord and blew the trumpet, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord followed them. And the armed men went before the priests, and blew with the trumpets, and the rearward came after the ark, the priests going on and blowing with the trumpets. So, again, there doesn't seem any delay. God told Joshua what to do. You don't see any questioning. He goes before the priests, before these men, and says, this is what we're going to do. And you don't see anything from the men that he gives the directions to. I got to love that. We didn't see that in the previous weeks that we've studied. There was always a questioning of God. And, the thing about it is we know the ending. We have the benefit of knowing how the story ends. But if you don't know that at the first and you don't know the ending, it seems like you might question God. But God works in odd ways. I remember some time back, I had the benefit, which I normally rarely don't get to participate in things and because of my schedule, but I was able to go with my daughter when she was teaching Vacation Bible School. And she's a really good teacher, my daughter is. And hopefully one day I'll be as good as her. And she was teaching some junior high girls, and she was showing a video of how God works different. And she was trying to teach her kids that God can work in unusual ways. And she showed this video of this couple that was from Jackson, Tennessee, which is a couple hours from here, going towards Memphis. And they were named the Mandrells. And they had been pastoring a church, but they felt like God was calling them to start a church somewhere. And so he felt led in his spirit to visit Denver, a particular city named Arvada, I think is what it's called. I think it's Arvada is how it's pronounced, Arvada. And this was a particular place that needed a church, and he just sensed that there was a need for it there. And while he was there, he met another couple that was visiting there that had the same vision, which is kind of odd. And they were from a church in Orlando, a First Baptist Church of Orlando. And so these two couples became good friends, and they ended up visiting their friends in Orlando and went to the First Baptist Church. And the person there, the other couple they met, shared their vision with that church in Orlando, that they had been to this city and met this other couple, and they felt like they were supposed to start a church there. And oddly enough, 68 people from First Baptist Church of Orlando decided they should go too. And they moved to Arvada. And they started this church in an elementary school there, and it's called Storyline Fellowship. It's still there now. They ended up buying a retail building that went out of business, and they turned it into a church, and it seems to be thriving. And the First Baptist Church in Orlando supported them for 3 years to help them with money and paid the lead pastor and that kind of thing so they could get their feet off the ground. But the point is that sometimes God still does work. Matter of fact, they're showing a video. If you go to the second service that from the North American Mission Board, that kind of follows that same narrative of people that are just feel led to do something, and God just puts something on their heart, and they just do it, and it's unusual things. And you'll see that video this morning. I think it's during the offering that you'll see that video. So God still works in unusual ways. God does things outside the box, and I'm thankful that he does. And sometimes we as Christians, we struggle with that. We think God can only work in confined ways, and if it's not in the parameters of the church, or if it doesn't feel churchy, or if it doesn't have this feel that we think it should have, then it can't be of God. It just that just seems a little freaky, or a little charismatic, or whatever label you want to put on it. And that being said, we should provide a litmus test. We should make sure that it is of God. I'm not saying that if you hear something that sounds a little crazy that you shouldn't test God and make sure that God does work in unconventional ways. And he still does. And he did it back here with this story of what he said he was going to do, of just marching around the walls. Just seems weird. And by the way, you can't say anything. Got to be quiet. No sound. Which, it would have been a little freaky to the people of Jericho that you got this army. What did you say? She couldn't do it?
She couldn't.
There must not be any women in.
Well, hey, don't you know though? Don't you know in this group of people there had to have been folks that struggled with that? Now, let me just say, we're not talking about a long distance. You're only talking 7 acres. Probably talking a half a mile, if depending on how far from the walls. I kind of wondered that this week. because I'm this person that I think these weird thoughts. Like, I wonder if they walked further. They had to walk further from the wall to leave room for the wall to fall flat, right? So that's the kind of thoughts I think. So so in other words, it may have been a little bit bigger distance, but no more than a mile. They're walking, so that wouldn't take you long. But you're being silent, and the people of Jericho had to have been just a little freaked out by it. So it happens, and then they're gone. And then the next day they show back up, and they're gone. And this happens for 6 days, which is really weird. So then verses 10 through 11, and it says, And Joshua had commanded the people that you shall not shout, make any noise with your voice, neither shall any word proceed out of your mouth until the day I bid you shout. Then you shall shout. So the ark of the Lord compassed the city, going about at once, and they came to the camp and lodged in it. And then verse 12, the Joshua rose up early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark. I just wonder, if God had given us some kind of directive like that, and our pastors said we were supposed to do something, what would be our reaction? What would we do? Would we think our pastor's gone nuts? Would we just chalk it up? Because our pastor is a little unorthodox at times. He's a little different. And would we just chalk it up to that? Or would we really do what we felt like he was calling us to do? And that was one of the things I thought about when I read this passage. Verses 12 through 15. So in verse 13, the Bible says, And the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord went on continually and blew with the trumpet, and the armed men before them, and the rearward came after the ark, the priests going on and blowing with the trumpets. And then the second day they compassed the city once and returned to the camp. So they did for 6 days. And then verse 15. But it came to pass on the 7th day, they rose up early about the dawning of the day. They compassed the city after the same manner 7 times. Only on that day they compassed the city 7 times. So, again, what I love that you're not seeing in here, and the Bible's really honest. We know if there was an issue here that it would have been mentioned. You don't see any questioning. None. And I feel confident that if there was, because we know over these last weeks we've seen God be really honest about the people and the leaders. He doesn't hide anytime there's a fault. And we're going to see next week. Again, he tells us about a secret sin. So I love the faith of the people here. It is a weird thing that he's being asked to do, that these people are being asked to do. And I can only imagine that later, once this is over, and I know I'm kind of fast forwarding here, but later, years later, the people that were involved in this, don't you think they told this story to their kids? And if you were part of the people that were marching around the city, there had to have been so the people in Jericho are experiencing it from one way. But if you're in the people that's marching around the city, you're experiencing it in another. And that had to have been something that resonated with these people over the years and decades. And as they got older, the fondness of how they saw God working. And God was doing it in a very unusual way. And I just wonder, has there ever been an instance in your life where you knew it was God, but it was unusual? And that, in and of itself, really was confirmation to you that it was God doing it. I've had some strange instances in my life where I knew it was God. And it's a comforting thing. It's to know that the God of the universe, and by the way, David, the way he's been talking about it, you see God, you understand God with a different perspective, how big he is and how big the universe is. He's showing all these things in these videos. And yet, the God that has built this universe that's so big scientists can't tell us how big it is involved in my little peon life. That really is humbling, really humbling. And so these people, I would imagine, looked on this very fondly years later. Then in verse 16, this is go time. And it came to pass on the seventh time, they went around 7 times now, the priests blew the trumpets, and Joshua said unto the people, shout. And I imagine they were so happy to shout. They've been, doing this, being quiet, and they were ready to let it out.
I'd be good at that part.
Yeah. and they did. And so he says, shout, for the Lord has given you this city. And then the thing happens. He says in verse 17, the city shall be accursed, even it and all that are in. The Lord, only Rahab the harlot shall live, and she that are in their house, and because she hid the messengers that we sent. And we see that in verse 20 it says, so the people shouted with the priests, blew the trumpets, and it came to pass when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. Now you notice verse 18. Did I read that? I don't know if I did. I need to. He mentions, Joshua does, in verse 17 he's talking about what you're going to get, but in verse 18 he says, and you in any wise keep yourselves from the accursed thing. What does your Bible say on that?
But as for you, only keep yourselves from the things designated for destruction.
Designated for destruction. Okay. And when you take of the accursed thing, or those things that you're not supposed to take of, you will make the camp of Israel a curse and trouble it. But all the silver and gold, the vessels of brass and iron, are consecrated to the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord. So he's telling them, he's giving them direct instructions. When the wall falls flat, you are to take the city, but don't take any of the stuff. We are to gather the bronze, the gold, and the silver, but all that is going to be given to the treasury of the Lord. The rest of the stuff do not take. And what's interesting is, in archaeological digs, this is the part I love. In the digs that they found, it's so interesting what they discovered. One of the things they discovered were in multiple rooms and places where you could tell people lived, they found jars full of wheat. Full of wheat. And lots of it. And that's exciting for a few reasons. One, the jars being full indicates the time of year it was. The time of year was spring. It also validates that in the springtime is when the Jordan River would be swollen. Okay? So they would have had jars full of wheat. The second thing it tells us is that they know all these people are outside their gates. So they are preparing for what's called a siege. And this wasn't unusual in those days. An army would come and surround a city and block it off and keep people from being able to have access of going in and out. And whatever means of food you had, that's what you survived on. And sometimes it would take months or years to completely be able to shut down a city. But in this case, we know it didn't take long because the jars are full of wheat. We know it only took how many days? 7 days. The other reason that it's interesting is because God told them not to plunder, not to take of anything. One of the things they definitely would have taken is the food. The wheat was a precious commodity. It was sometimes is used as money. So this tells us that the people obeyed God. What's also interesting is, if you notice in verse 24, somebody read verse 24.
And they burned the city with fire and all that was in it. Only the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord.
So they burned the city. Guess what they found when they found all those jars of wheat? It was burnt. It was burnt. All the jars of wheat were black. There's pictures of it online. You can see it. They actually take it out. It's black wheat. Again, validating the Bible's version of this, which there's no secular version of it. It's only in the Bible. And it's really, really interesting. The other thing that's interesting is you see that the walls fell down flat. In archaeological digs, they found the retaining wall that fell. It's made out of mud brick. It's still there. And the other part of the wall, in some places, is still there as well. But when that retaining wall fell flat, what it did was create a ramp that allowed them to go up into the city. And you can see pictures of that. It's really, really cool. So when God does it right. The other thing that's interesting about it too is they found on the north side of the wall, there's one part of the wall that didn't collapse. Do you know who lived on that side of the wall? Rahab. And where it's at geographically, you can see the hills where she told the two spies to go to hide for 2 days until the army had given up finding them. It's a wonderful story. And all of that is has been proven by archaeologists. It's a wonderful story. Atheists don't like that at all. What can we gather from this story? What do you think we can gather from this story? Does God still break down walls today? Has he ever broke down a wall in your life? Have you ever had an experience like this where you came in upon an impregnable situation that just seemed physically impossible for you to breach, but God tore down the walls? And you've experienced it some, Bentley.
Yeah.
And God still does that today. God does care, and God will break down the walls. And sometimes he gives us unorthodox ways to approach things. And we need to be sensitive to that.
And that's what I was thinking of, because, you had to, I mean, in modern day, military, it's all about the element of surprise. And there was, they marched for 7 days. The city knew they were there. They didn't know what they were doing. Can you imagine? Okay, they're just walking around. They're not doing anything. They're not saying anything. What's going on here? But, in our thinking, it's all about the element of surprise, to do things that, that take someone off guard. But they even knew it was coming, didn't know how it was coming, but, there was no element of surprise. It was right there,
Yeah.
In front of them. So, and yet they were still able to,
Mm-hmm. Well,
interesting.
I would love to say that, this story ends happily ever after, and unfortunately next week there's a negative side to this story of something that happened during this siege here, if you want to call it, or attack. There's something that happened, and one man really made a mistake, and we're going to talk a little bit about that next week. Just not to take too much thunder from next week, but anytime your lesson starts off with the word "but," that's kind of where we're going next week.
I was thinking AI. I said to Jeff, I was reading chapter 7 before work the other morning, and I was like, now we got to talk about AI and Bible.
That's true.